The rain had not stopped for 11 days. It fell in sheets across the Valdran expanse, turning the ancient trade roads into rivers of mud, collapsing the weaker structures along the merchant corridors and drowning the already thin hope that winter would be kind. The caravans had stopped running. The outposts had gone silent. And in the wreckage of what had once been a forward operating base for the Confederated Reclamation Corps, a man sat in the dark and tried to remember what his own hands looked like. His name was Sira Cade. He had been a soldier once, a good one by every metric the Corps used to measure such things: accuracy ratings, mission completion percentages, psychological resilience scores. He had worn the gray andiron uniform with the crossed hammer emblem on his chest, and he had believed in what it represented: the reclamation of lost territory, the pushing back of wild lands that had swallowed human civilization in the Severance Wars 2 centuries ago. The slow, grinding, beautiful work of taking back what humanity had lost. That belief had a weight to it, a physical gravitational pull in his chest that made every forced march through swampland feel purposeful, every night spent in a frozen watchtower feel noble. He had carried that weight across 4 years of deployments, through battles with the scaled things that lived in the deep places of the world, through the loss of friends and the incremental gains of territory measured in kilometers of reclaimed road. Then the weight had been cut out of him. Not metaphorically, not in the way that poets described losing faith slowly, beautifully, with tears. It had been cut out of him on a Tuesday afternoon in a place called the Thornspine Basin, when a command decision had been made over a communications relay that Sira had watched his squad follow without question, and the decision had been wrong, and 11 people had died because of it. And he had survived only because a collapsing rock formation had thrown him clear while it buried everyone else. 11 people. He knew their names. He said them every night before sleep took him, a rosary of the dead that had worn grooves into his mind like river stones worn smooth by current. Vos tren alara delorum yesit, prachcoil hannah benjel mira. 11 names. 11 people who had trusted the chain of command, and the chain of command had fed them into a meat grinder built from bad intelligence and bureaucratic indifference. And the Corps had called it an acceptable loss ratio in the after-action report. And Sira Cade had taken his sidearm, placed it on the table in front of his commanding officer, and walked out of the nearest gate into the wilderness without a word. That had been 7 months ago. Now he sat in the ruins of an abandoned outpost, in a room that had once been a communications hub, with rain leaking through a shattered skylight and pooling on the concrete floor around his boots. His uniform was gone, replaced by scavenged clothing, a wool coat too large for him, trousers patched in 6 places, boots held together with wire and determination. His face was thinner than it had been, his jaw was sharper. His eyes, which had once been described by a fellow soldier as the kind you want watching your back, were now the kind you avoided on the street. He was not okay, he knew this. He had no intention of doing anything about it. The rain hammered on the roof. The wind pushed through the gaps in the walls with a sound like breath. Sira sat with his back against the console that had once powered a long-range radio, and he stared at nothing, and he existed in that particular way that broken people exist, not living, not dying, just taking up space while the world moved around them. Then he heard the sound. It was not the rain, it was not the wind. It was a sound that did not belong in the Valdran expanse or anywhere near human habitation. A high, thin, trembling note that cut through the storm like a blade through silk. It was a cry, but not like any animal cry Sira had heard in his years of deployment. It was too musical, too layered. It carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones, in the spaces between his ribs, in the hollow places inside him that the grief had carved out. It sounded like something dying. It sounded like something calling for help. Sira closed his eyes. He pressed his head back against the console. He told himself with every ounce of discipline left in his fractured mind that he was not going to move, that he was done with responding to cries in the dark, that the last time he had answered a call like that, 11 people had stopped existing. The cry came again, weaker this time, and underneath it was a sound that Sira's hindbrain, the ancient, primal part of the human mind that had kept the species alive through ice ages and predator attacks, and every catastrophe the world had thrown at it, identified immediately. It was the sound of something very young and very alone and very cold. Sira stood up. He told himself he hated himself for it as he pulled on his coat and checked the knife at his belt, the only weapon he carried now, because firearms reminded him of things he could not afford to remember. He told himself he was a fool, a broken fool walking into a storm to find something that was almost certainly going to be dangerous, because the Valdran expanse was wild territory, and wild things in wild territory did not survive by being harmless. He stepped out into the rain. The cold hit him like a wall. The water was falling with a violence that made visibility nearly useless, but Sira had been trained to move through worse. His body remembered what his mind tried to forget: the patterns of movement, the way to use terrain, the method of scanning for threats while moving toward an objective. He moved through the ruins of the outpost with a fluidity that contradicted everything about his appearance, hopping over fallen beams, sliding through a collapsed doorway, navigating the debris field with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 different places. The cry came again, closer now. He followed it past the outpost perimeter, into the tree line that marked the boundary between reclaimed and wild. The trees here were enormous old-growth species that had been here long before the Severance Wars, long before humanity had pushed this far into the frontier. Their trunks were wider than Sira could reach around, and their canopies formed a ceiling so dense that even without the rain, the forest floor would have been dark. The cry was coming from a ravine about 200 meters ahead. Sira could see it now, a gash in the earth where the rainwater had been eroding the soil for centuries, exposing roots and rock layers in a jagged cross-section. The sound was echoing up from somewhere inside it, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly. He stopped at the edge. He looked down into the darkness. Everything in his training, everything in his experience, told him that this was a trap. The wild lands were full of creatures that used vocal mimicry to lure prey. The drakes that lived in these mountains were known to imitate the sounds of injured animals to draw in scavengers, and then the scavengers became the scavenged. Going down there alone at night in a storm with nothing but a knife was the kind of decision that the after-action report summed up in a single word: fatal. Sira started climbing down. The ravine wall was slick with mud and rain, and he slipped twice, catching himself on exposed roots that groaned under his weight but held. The darkness deepened as he descended until he was operating entirely on feel, his hands finding handholds, his boots finding ledges, his body moving with a precision that surprised him. It was like his muscle memory had been waiting for something worth doing, and now that it had found it, it refused to let him fail. He reached the bottom. The floor of the ravine was a river of mud and runoff, ankle-deep and ice-cold. The walls rose on either side, blocking most of the rain but creating a channel for the wind that howled through the gap with a mournful sound. And there, against the base of the ravine wall, in a hollow formed by a mass of exposed roots, was the source of the cry. Sira stopped breathing. It was small. That was the first thing his mind registered. Small and wet and trembling, curled into a ball that could have fit in his two hands. Its body was covered in scales that were so thin and translucent they looked like they had been painted on, and underneath them, Sira could see the faint network of veins and capillaries that carried something luminous through the creature's system. The scales were a deep midnight blue, the color of the sky just before the stars came out, and they shifted and rippled with every trembling breath the creature took. Its wings were folded against its body, and they were wrong, crumpled, bent at angles that made Sira's stomach lurch. One of them was twisted completely backward, the membrane torn, the delicate bone structure visible through the rip in the wing like the frame of a broken umbrella. The other was pinned beneath the creature's body at an angle that suggested it wasn't broken so much as it had simply given up on working. Its tail was wrapped around itself in a tight spiral, the tip flicking weakly with each cry. And its eyes were open. They glowed. Not reflected light, not bioluminescence in the way that certain deep-sea creatures produced light. These eyes glowed with a radiance that was warm and golden and utterly, impossibly beautiful, like someone had taken two stars and set them into the face of something that should not have been able to contain that much light. They were the eyes of something ancient and powerful, something that had no business being in a ravine in the middle of a storm, something that stories and legends and nightmares had been built around for as long as humans had been telling stories. They were the eyes of a dragon. Sira Cade stood in the mud of a ravine in the Valdrin expanse and looked at a baby dragon that was the size of a house cat. And his mind, which had been so carefully constructed around the architecture of human superiority and military doctrine and the absolute certainty that dragons were the enemy, did something it had not done in 7 months. It stuttered. Because this was not the enemy. This was not the massive, scaled horror that had descended on core positions during the Severance Wars, unleashing fire that melted stone and shattered steel. This was not the creature from the briefing videos, the ones that had been used to justify every aggressive action the Corps had ever taken in the wild lands. This was a baby. A baby that was hurt and alone and scared and looking at him with eyes that contained the light of stars and an expression that Sira, despite every reason not to, recognized. It was the same expression he had seen in his own reflection every morning for 7 months. Help me or don't. I don't have the energy to care anymore, but I'm still making the sound because something deep inside me refuses to stop asking. The dragon's cry had stopped the moment Sira reached the bottom of the ravine. It was watching him now, those star-filled eyes tracking his movements with an intelligence that was unsettling in something so small. Its body was still trembling, but the trembling had changed quality. It was less the shivering of cold and more the tension of a creature deciding, in real time, whether the thing in front of it was a threat or not. Sira knew what he should do. Every survival instinct he possessed, every piece of training the Corps had beaten into him, every rational thought in his head told him the same thing: walk away. This was a dragon. Dragons were the declared enemies of human reclamation efforts. They were classified as apex threats by the Confederated Reclamation Corps, and killing them was not just permitted but encouraged, with bounties and commendations and career advancement attached to every confirmed kill. But the dragon's wing was broken, and its eyes were stars. And it was alone in the dark, and the rain was falling, and Sira Cade had not been able to save 11 people who had trusted him, and the weight of that failure was a hole in his chest that ached every single moment of every single day. And right now, in this ravine, in this storm, there was one small, broken thing that he could save, and the idea of walking away from it felt less like a rational decision and more like another kind of dying. He crouched down. Slowly, hands open, palms visible. The universal body language of "I am not a threat" that transcended species, that was hardwired into the biology of every creature that had ever lived in a world where something bigger might want to eat it. The dragon's eyes tracked his movement. The glow in them intensified slightly, and Sira felt a warmth on his face as if someone had held a candle inches from his skin. There was no heat behind it, it was something else, something he didn't have a word for. It felt like being seen. Not observed, not assessed, but truly seen in a way that went deeper than vision, that reached past his eyes and his face, and his scarred hands and touched something inside him that he had assumed was permanently buried under rubble and grief. He stayed crouched, he didn't move closer. He just existed in the mud, in the rain, in the dark, and let the dragon decide. The seconds stretched into a minute. The wind howled through the ravine. The mud sucked at his boots. The dragon's trembling continued, but its eyes never left his face, and slowly, so slowly that Sira might have imagined it, the tension in the creature's body began to ease, not completely, not even close, but enough. Enough that the crumpled wing relaxed slightly. Enough that the coiled tail loosened by a single degree. Enough that the glow in those star-filled eyes softened from a sharp, defensive brilliance to something warmer. Something that reminded Sira inexplicably of the way campfire light looked on the faces of people who had finally stopped being afraid. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the only thing he had that might possibly matter to a wounded creature. A strip of dried meat, the last of his rations, which he had been saving because he hadn't been able to bring himself to care about whether he ate or not. He held it out. The dragon's nostrils flared. A thin wisp of something that was not quite smoke and not quite steam escaped from between its teeth, tiny, barely visible teeth that were nonetheless sharp enough to catch the dim light. Its head lifted slightly, and Sira saw the full effect of those eyes in the darkness of the ravine, and it was staggering. They didn't just glow, they illuminated. The light from them fell on the mud around the dragon, on the broken wing, on Sira's outstretched hand, and in that light everything looked different, softer, less broken. The dragon stretched its neck forward. Its tongue, long, thin, forked at the tip, touched the strip of dried meat. It recoiled immediately, pulling back into its hollow with a hiss that was more fear than aggression, its eyes flaring bright again. Sira didn't move, he didn't pull his hand back. He just held the meat there in the rain, in the mud, in the dark, and waited. 2 more minutes passed, the dragon's breathing slowed. Its eyes dimmed to that warm, soft glow again. And this time, when it stretched its neck forward, it didn't recoil. It took the meat from Sira's fingers with a delicacy that was astonishing, its teeth barely grazing his skin, and it swallowed the strip whole and made a sound that Sira had never heard before. It was a hum. Low and resonant and warm, a vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the dragon's body and radiate outward through the air and the mud and into Sira's chest, where it settled against the hole where the weight used to be and pressed against it, gently, like a hand pressing against a wound. Sira's vision blurred. He had not cried in 7 months. He had tried in the early days, sitting in the wreckage of his life, willing the tears to come because he knew from his training, from the psychological resilience courses that every Corps soldier was required to take, that suppression was dangerous, that grief needed an outlet, that the body and mind could only contain so much before something ruptured. But the tears had not come. There had been a blockage somewhere inside him, a dam that held back everything, and he had not been able to find the release valve. Now, kneeling in the mud of a ravine, watching a baby dragon the size of a house cat hum after eating a strip of dried meat, the dam cracked. Not broke, cracked. A single tear escaped, tracing a line down his face through the rain, and he let it happen. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't try to stop it. He just knelt there and let the dragon hum and felt the crack in the dam widen by a millimeter and knew that this was not healing, not yet, not nearly, but it was the first time in 7 months that something inside him had moved in the right direction. He reached out again, slowly, palms open. The dragon watched, its eyes glowed. The light fell on his hands, and for the first time Sira noticed what the dragon light revealed about his own skin. The scars on his palms from the Thornspine Basin from when he had dug through rubble with his bare hands trying to find survivors who were already dead seemed different in the dragon's light, less like damage and more like evidence. Evidence that he had tried. That when everything fell apart, he had used his own hands to reach into the wreckage, even when there was nothing to find. The dragon pressed its snout into his palm. The contact was electric, not in the dramatic, theatrical way that stories describe such moments. There was no flash of light, no mystical bond forming, no sudden surge of power. It was simpler than that and more profound. It was warmth. It was the texture of scales so fine they felt like silk over stone. It was the dragon's breath, warm and steady now, flowing over his skin. It was the way those star-filled eyes closed slowly, deliberately, as if the dragon was making a choice and the choice was you. Cade, who had not been trusted with anything important in 7 months, who had failed the 11 people who had depended on him, who had walked away from everything he had ever believed in because believing had become too painful. Cade was trusted by a baby dragon with broken wings and eyes like stars. He did not deserve it. He knew this with absolute certainty. But the dragon did not know about deserved. The dragon knew about cold and pain and fear and the dark and the sound of rain and the feeling of being alone. And it knew that the creature in front of it had come down into the dark when it didn't have to, and had offered food when it had none to spare, and had sat in the mud without moving until trust was possible. The dragon did not care about Sira's failures, it cared about Sira's hands. He gathered the dragon carefully, supporting the broken wing with gentle pressure, cradling the small body against his chest. The dragon weighed almost nothing. It was lighter than it should have been, lighter than a healthy creature of its size would have been, and Sira could feel every rib through the thin scales, could feel the rapid flutter of a heartbeat that was too fast and too fragile. The dragon's head rested against the hollow of his throat, and the glow of its eyes was muted now, close-lidded and soft, casting a warm light against Sira's jaw that he could feel as much as see. He climbed out of the ravines. It was harder going up than it had been coming down, especially with the dragon in his arms, but he managed it with a slowness and deliberateness that surprised him. Every step was placed with care. Every handhold was tested before he committed his weight. The dragon stirred once during the climb, making a small sound that was half cry and half something else, and Sira whispered without thinking, without deciding to, "I've got you." And the dragon went still against him, and the warmth of its body seeped through his soaked coat and into his chest, and the hole where the weight used to be ached differently. Not less, just differently. He made it back to the communications hub as the storm reached its peak. The wind was screaming now, the rain horizontal, the whole structure groaning under the assault. He set the dragon down on the only dry surface he could find, the top of the console, where a piece of intact roofing still provided cover, and he stripped off his coat, which was soaked through but still warmer than nothing, and he draped it over the dragon's body, creating a makeshift nest of wool and desperation. The dragon's eyes opened. Those stars looked up at him, and Sira saw something in them that he did not expect. Recognition. Not of him specifically, they had known each other for less than an hour, but recognition of what he was doing. The dragon understood, on some level that transcended language and species, that this wet, shivering, broken creature had wrapped itself around a smaller, more broken creature and said, "Without words, your survival matters to me." The dragon hummed again. That sound, that low, warm, resonant hum that seemed to bypass Sira's ears entirely and speak directly to the damaged architecture of his interior landscape. He sat on the floor with his back against the console, the dragon above him wrapped in his coat, and the hum filled the space between them like a third presence, and Sira closed his eyes and let it happen. He did not sleep, but for the first time in 7 months he rested. The days that followed were a study in the particular kind of madness that comes from caring about something when you have spent months cultivating the belief that caring is a liability. Sira did not know how to take care of a dragon. He did not know what dragons ate beyond the dried meat strip that had been accepted, did not know how to set a broken wing on a creature whose biology was fundamentally alien to everything he had been taught, did not know if dragons carried diseases that could cross the species barrier, did not know if the dragon's parents were nearby and would arrive at any moment to incinerate him for touching their offspring. He knew none of these things, and he did them anyway. The wing was the first priority. Sira had set broken bones before a field medicine was a required competency in the Corps, and he had patched up more fractures than he could count during his years of deployment. But a dragon's wing was not a human arm. The bone structure was different, lighter, more complex, with secondary joints that seemed to serve purposes he couldn't identify. The membrane that formed the flight surface was unlike anything in human anatomy. A living material that responded to touch by shifting color, darkening where his fingers pressed and lightening when they released. He fashioned a splint from pieces of the shattered console casing and strips of fabric torn from a ruined uniform he found in a storage locker. The dragon watched him work with those star-filled eyes, its body perfectly still, its trust absolute and terrifying in its completeness. When he needed to manipulate the broken wing to align the bones, the dragon made a sound, a sharp, high-pitched keen that cut through Sira like a knife, but it did not pull away. It did not bite. It did not flame. It trusted him through the pain. Sira's hands were shaking by the time he finished. Not from cold, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he was holding in those hands, not the dragon's wing, but the dragon's trust, which was a thing so fragile and so precious that he was afraid to breathe on it lest it shatter. The wing set healed over the following days. Not completely, Sira was not a veterinarian, and dragon biology was a mystery that the Corps had spent centuries trying to unravel with limited success, but well enough that the dragon could extend it partially without the keen of pain. The torn membrane knitted itself back together with a speed that suggested dragon healing was something fundamentally different from human healing, as if their bodies existed on a different timeline, one where damage was remembered but not dwelt upon. Sira envied that he dwelt on everything. He fed the dragon what he could find. The dried meat had been accepted, so he scrounged more from the abandoned supplies in the outpost sealed rations that had survived the weather emergency provisions that someone had stockpiled and then never used. The dragon ate without hesitation now, taking food from his fingers with that same delicate precision, and after each meal it would hum, and the hum would find the hole in Sira's chest and press against it, and the hole would ache differently. He started talking to it, not because he thought the dragon understood, although the intelligence in those eyes suggested comprehension of a depth that made him uncomfortable, but because the silence of the outpost was worse than the sound of his own voice. He told the dragon things he had not told anyone, about the Thornspine Basin, about the 11 names, about the weight that had been cut out of him and the hole it had left behind. About the dreams that woke him every night, dreams where he was digging through rubble and finding faces he knew, and the faces were asking him why he had survived, and he never had an answer. The dragon listened. It listened with its whole body, the way certain animals do, not just with ears but with posture and stillness and the direction of its gaze. When Sira's voice cracked, the dragon's glow would dim as if it was trying to make the dark less oppressive by becoming part of it. When his voice hardened with anger, the glow would brighten, not aggressively but supportively, as if to say, "I am here and I am not afraid of what you feel." On the 5th day, the dragon crawled into his lap. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no fanfare, no swelling music, no profound realization. The dragon simply finished eating, looked at Sira with those star-filled eyes, and walked forward on legs that were still slightly unsteady and climbed into his lap with the casual confidence of a creature that had already made its decision and saw no reason to announce it. It curled up there, its head resting on his thigh, its broken wing tucked carefully against its body, its tail wrapping around his wrist in a loose spiral that was warm and slightly rough with the texture of those fine silk-over-stone scales. Sira sat perfectly still. His hands hovered in the air above the dragon's body, unsure where to put them, afraid that touching it would break something, not the dragon but the moment, which felt like spun glass, beautiful and impermanent and impossible. The dragon made a sound, not a hum this time, something softer. Something that vibrated through Sira's thigh and into his bones and resonated in the hole in his chest in a frequency that was so specifically right that it made his eyes sting. He put his hand on the dragon's back. The scales were warm. They had always been warm from the first moment in the ravine, but this was different. This was the warmth of a living thing choosing to share its heat with another living thing, and the choice was the point, the choice was everything, because the dragon could have stayed in its nest of coat fabric on the console, but it had chosen him, had chosen his lap, had chosen the imperfect, scarred, broken surface of Sira Cade over every other option available to it. He stroked the dragon's back, feeling the ridges of its spine beneath the scales, feeling the expansion and contraction of its breathing, feeling the subtle shift of its body as it settled deeper into his lap. His hand moved with a gentleness that he had not known he possessed, or perhaps had always possessed but had never had reason to use because the Corps did not reward gentleness, and war did not permit it, and grief did not allow it. But the dragon allowed it, the dragon wanted it. And in the allowing and the wanting, Sira felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, not with the crash and thunder of a breakthrough, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible movement of a tectonic plate, invisible, unstoppable, world-changing. On the 8th day, the storm broke. Sira stepped outside the outpost and saw the sky for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and it was vast and blue and so bright after days of gray that it hurt his eyes. The Valdran expanse spread out before him in every direction, rolling hills covered in the stubble of winter grass, dark forest in the distance, mountains on the horizon with peaks lost in clouds that were finally white instead of iron. The dragon was on his shoulder. It had started riding there on the 6th day, climbing up his arm with a determination that belied its injured wing, settling into the space between his neck and his collarbone as if that spot had been designed for it. Its tail wrapped around his arm for balance, and its head was tucked against his jaw, and its eyes were half closed, and the glow from them was a constant, warm presence on the edge of his peripheral vision. He looked at the landscape and felt something he had not felt in 7 months. Not hope, it was too early for hope, too raw, too fragile. But the absence of despair, which was a different thing entirely, and which he had not realized he could feel until he felt it. And it was like surfacing from deep water and realizing that air had been there the whole time, waiting for him to stop holding his breath. He needed to move. The outpost had no sustainable food source, and while dragon healing was remarkable, the dragon was still underweight and still recovering. They needed to find a place with resources, shelter, and critically no core presence. Because if the Confederated Reclamation Corps found a living dragon in the company of a deserter, the consequences would be immediate and terminal for both of them. He started walking. The dragon rode on his shoulder, a small, warm, star-glowing weight against his neck, and Sira walked through the Valdrin expanse with the careful, measured pace of a man who had learned to conserve energy because he no longer had a supply chain to rely on. He navigated by landmarks and sun position, old skills resurfacing like coins in a drained fountain, and by the end of the first day of walking, he had covered 15 kilometers without incident. The dragon ate what he caught, small game mostly, trapped with snares made from wire and cord. Sira cooked the meat over a fire he built in a sheltered hollow, and the dragon would sit next to him, close enough that their bodies were almost touching, and watch the flames with those star-filled eyes, and the glow of its eyes and the glow of the fire would merge into something that made the darkness around them feel not empty but full, as if the space between the stars was not void but potential. On the third day of walking, they encountered another person. He was a trapper, a heavy-set man with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that calculated Sira's threat level in the span of a heartbeat. He was standing at a crossroads, a string of rabbit pelts over his shoulder, and when he saw Sira, his hand went to the club at his belt. Then he saw the dragon. His face went through a rapid succession of expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, and finally a kind of horrified fascination that Sira recognized from his own reaction in the ravine. The dragon's eyes had flared bright at the sight of the stranger, the glow intensifying to a sharp defensive brilliance, and a low sound was coming from its throat, not a hiss, not a growl, but something between them, a vibration that Sira felt through his shoulder and into his skull. "It's all right," Sira said to the dragon. His voice was calm, steadier than it had been in months, and the dragon's glow dimmed slightly at the sound. Not relaxed, not even close, but no longer at the pitch of imminent violence. The trapper stared. "That's a dragon." "Oh yes." "On your shoulder." "Oh yes." It's the trapper's mouth worked. "They'll kill you for that, the cor'll kill you for that." "I'm aware." The trapper looked at Sira for a long moment, and something passed between them, not understanding, not empathy, but a recognition of a different kind. The recognition of one person who lived outside the boundaries seeing another person who lived outside the boundaries, and understanding that the space outside was neither safe nor simple, but it was where they were, and that was enough. "There's an old way station about 10 kilometers west," the trapper said finally. "Abandoned since the severance. It's got a well and good walls. Nobody goes there anymore because of the stories." "What stories?" The trapper looked at the dragon again. "The kind that keep people away, should keep the core away too if that matters to you." It did. It mattered more than the trapper could possibly know. "Thank you," Sira said. The trapper nodded once sharply and turned and walked away without looking back, and Sira was left with the distinct impression that this conversation had never happened, and that was fine by him. They reached the way station on the evening of the 4th day. The trapper had been right about the stories. The building was old, pre-severance construction built from stone and timber in a style that hadn't been used in 200 years. It sat in a small valley half hidden by overgrown vegetation, and the walls were thick enough to stop anything short of a direct artillery strike. The well in the courtyard was functional, the water clean and cold. The interior was dry, the roof intact, the windows shuttered. And there were marks on the walls. Old marks faded by time but still visible, claw marks scored deep into the stone in patterns that Sira's trained eye recognized as territorial markers. Not human, not animal in the conventional sense. Dragon. The way station had been a dragon place once, long ago. Before the wars, before the reclamation, before humanity had decided that dragons were enemies to be exterminated rather than neighbors to be understood. The marks said this is ours, and the age of them said this was ours before you came, and the absence of fresh marks said we left but we remember. The dragon on his shoulder made a sound, not defensive this time, something quieter, something that echoed against the stone walls and found the old marks and resonated with them, as if the sound and the marks were the same language separated by centuries. The dragon's glow was soft, warm, the color of sunset. Sira set up their living space with the methodical efficiency of a soldier-making camp, but with a care that no military manual had ever prescribed. He cleared debris from the main room, found dry wood for a fire, checked the structural integrity of the roof, tested the well water. The dragon watched from its perch on a stone ledge near the window, its good wing half extended, stretching muscles that were finally healing properly. When the fire was burning and the room was warm, the dragon flew. Not well, not far. The broken wing was still weak, still healing, still not capable of full flight. But it extended both wings, the healed one strong and steady, the recovering one trembling but functional, and it launched itself from the ledge and crossed the room in a wobbly, uneven arc that ended with it landing on Sira's chest and tumbling into his lap with an indignant squeak that was so utterly undignified for a creature with eyes like stars that Sira laughed. He laughed. The sound startled him almost as much as it startled the dragon. It came from somewhere he had forgotten existed, a place below the grief and above the numbness. A place that remembered what it felt like to find something funny, to let joy exist without qualifying it, to let air out of your lungs in a burst of sound that had no strategic purpose and no survival value, and was, for that exact reason, one of the most human things a person could do. The dragon looked up at him from his lap, its star-filled eyes wide with surprise, and this was the moment that Sira would carry with him for the rest of his life. The moment that would define everything that came after. The dragon laughed too. It was not a human laugh. It was a series of chirping sounds, high and bright and layered with harmonics that resonated in the stone walls and the warm air and the hollow spaces of Sira's chest. It was the sound of something young and alive and delighted, a sound that had no business existing in a world as hard as this one. And yet here they were, a broken man and a broken dragon laughing in an abandoned way station while the fire burned and the darkness held back beyond the walls. The dragon pressed its head against Sira's chest, right over his heart, and hummed. And this time the hum did not just press against the hole in his chest, it filled it. Not completely, the hole was too large, too deep, too old to be filled by a single moment. But it filled a corner of it, a small, warm, starlit corner, and Sira put his hand on the dragon's back and felt its heartbeat against his palm, and he understood something that no core briefing, no after-action report, no psychological resilience course had ever taught him. He understood that healing was not the opposite of breaking. It was something that happened alongside breaking, running in parallel, sometimes fast and sometimes slow, sometimes visible and sometimes invisible, but always present as long as there was something worth healing for. The dragon was worth healing for. Not because the dragon needed him, although it did, in the practical sense of food and shelter and a splinted wing, but because the act of caring for the dragon was itself a form of repair, a way of rebuilding the architecture of his interior landscape one small, deliberate act at a time. Every meal he prepared was a brick. Every careful touch of the healing wing was a beam. Every night spent with the dragon's warmth against his chest was a roof, keeping out the rain that had been falling inside him for 7 months. He was not fixed, he would not be fixed for a long time, perhaps ever. The names were still there: Voss, Tren, Alara, Del, Orem, Yesit, Prach, Coil, Hannah, Benjel, Mira, and they would always be there, carved into the walls of his mind like the dragon marks on the way station stones. But the marks were not the whole story. The marks said this happened, not this is all there is. The dragon's eyes glowed like stars, and in their light Sira Cade could see the shape of something that was not whole but was no longer empty, something that was cracked and patched and scarred and still, impossibly, stubbornly, irrationally alive. He leaned back against the wall, the dragon on his chest, the fire burning low, and for the first time in 7 months he did not say the names before sleep took him. He said something else instead. "Stay," he whispered. The dragon's glow warmed against his jaw, and the hum deepened, and the warmth spread through his chest like sunrise, and the dragon's tail tightened around his wrist, and that was answer enough. Outside, the Valdrin expanse stretched into darkness, wild and dangerous and indifferent to the small, fragile thing happening in the abandoned way station. Somewhere the core was planning its next campaign. Somewhere dragons flew through skis that humans had never mapped. Somewhere the world continued its indifferent turning, unconcerned with the wounds of soldiers or the broken wings of baby dragons. But here, in this room, in this moment, a human being and a dragon had found each other in the dark. And the finding had changed them both, and the change was small but real, and real was enough, and enough was everything. The baby dragon's eyes glowed like stars. And the broken human held on and was held, and the night passed without nightmares, and the morning came, and they were still there. Still there. Still breathing. Still choosing to be there. And in a world that had given Sira Cade every reason to stop choosing, that was the most radical act of defiance imaginable. He woke to the feeling of a small, warm tongue licking his ear, and he opened his eyes to starlight in a dark room, and he laughed again, and the dragon chirped, and the sound of their laughter bounced off 200-year-old stone walls marked with claws, and the marks hummed in sympathy, and the morning came through the shutters in bars of gold. And somewhere in the distance a bird was singing, and the well was full, and the walls were strong, and the dragon's wing was healing, and the man's heart was beating. And the world was broken and beautiful and full of things that wanted to live. It was not a happy ending. It was not an ending at all. It was a beginning, small, fragile, imperfect, real, and it started with a cry in the dark, and a man who should have walked away but didn't, and a baby dragon with eyes like stars that looked at a broken human and saw something worth trusting. The dragon trusted him. And Sira Cade, for the first time in 7 months, trusted himself to be worthy of it. Not completely, not yet. But enough. Enough to start.